What shocks a narcissistic person isn't always your anger. Sometimes it's the moment they realize they can no longer control your emotions. You stop explaining, you stop chasing, you stop reacting, and suddenly the person who once seemed to have so much power over you discovers that their access to you was the real source of that power. And here is the part people often don't expect. The thing that affects them most may have very little to do with defeating them. It may simply be you becoming emotionally unavailable to the cycle they created. Think about this carefully. Have you ever noticed that the more you explained yourself, the more questions appeared? The more you tried to prove your intentions, the more you were accused of having bad ones? The more you wanted peace, the more conflicts seemed to appear? If you've experienced that pattern, stay with me, because these 7 things aren't about playing psychological games. They're about understanding what happens when you stop supplying the reactions that keep a dysfunctional dynamic alive. One of the most powerful shifts happens when you stop needing a narcissistic person to approve of you, understand you, or validate your version of reality. And this is much harder than it sounds, because when you've spent a long time in a relationship where your feelings were questioned, your intentions were criticized, or your character was constantly put on trial, you can become dependent on the other person's reaction to know whether you're okay. You may find yourself thinking, do they think I'm a good person? Do they finally understand why I was hurt? Do they believe me? Do they regret what they did? And without realizing it, your emotional stability becomes connected to their opinion. But here's the shift. Their opinion is not a psychological report on your character. Someone can misunderstand you and you can still know who you are. Someone can accuse you of being selfish and you can still act with integrity. Someone can refuse to acknowledge the harm they caused, and that doesn't erase what you experienced. When you stop seeking their approval, you also stop over-explaining yourself. You don't feel compelled to provide evidence for every decision. You don't spend hours trying to convince them that your feelings are legitimate. You don't keep reopening the same conversation hoping that this time they'll finally understand. And that can be deeply uncomfortable for someone who is accustomed to having emotional influence over you. If they were used to seeing you defend yourself, chase reassurance, apologize excessively, or become distressed when they disapproved of you, your emotional independence changes the entire dynamic. But remember, this isn't about trying to shock them or punish them. It's about becoming less dependent on external validation. You begin saying, I know what I experienced. I know why I made this decision. I don't need you to agree with me. That is not arrogance. That is emotional autonomy. And once you no longer need someone else to confirm your worth, their ability to destabilize you becomes much smaller. You stop performing for their approval and start living according to your own values. That is when their opinion becomes information rather than a verdict. There comes a point when you realize that explaining yourself is no longer creating understanding. It is simply keeping you trapped in a conversation where the goalposts keep moving. You explain what happened, and suddenly you're being questioned about your tone. You clarify your intentions, and now you're defending your character. You provide evidence, and somehow there is another accusation waiting for you. Before you know it, you're exhausted, frustrated, and wondering how a simple disagreement turned into an interrogation of your entire personality. This is why stopping the endless explanations can be such a powerful shift. When someone is genuinely trying to understand you, clarification usually brings the conversation closer to resolution. But when communication becomes a vehicle for manipulation, more explanations can simply create more opportunities for your words to be twisted, challenged, or taken out of context. You might say, I don't want to do that. And instead of immediately listing 10 reasons why, you allow the statement to stand. You might say, "That conversation isn't healthy for me." And you don't spend the next 20 minutes trying to prove that it isn't. You might say, "I've made my decision." And you recognize that a decision doesn't become legitimate only after someone else approves it. This can feel incredibly uncomfortable at first, especially if you've been conditioned to believe that keeping the peace means constantly defending yourself. You may worry that if you don't explain enough, you'll be misunderstood. But here's the difficult truth. Someone committed to misunderstanding you cannot always be persuaded by better explanations. You don't have to attend every argument you're invited to. You don't have to correct every accusation. You don't have to turn your personal boundaries into courtroom cases. And this isn't about becoming cold, silent, or emotionally unavailable. Healthy communication still matters. The difference is learning to recognize when communication is productive and when it has become circular. When you stop explaining every detail, you begin conserving something extremely valuable: your emotional energy. You stop trying to control another person's interpretation of you. You accept that they may tell a different story about you, and you don't have to spend your life correcting it. Sometimes the strongest sentence is simply, "I've said what I needed to say." A boundary becomes powerful when it stops being something you repeatedly announce and becomes something you consistently practice. This is especially important in relationships where your limits have been questioned, ignored, or repeatedly pushed. You may have said, "Please don't speak to me that way," only to find yourself explaining the same request again and again. Over time, you can start believing that the problem is that you haven't explained the boundary clearly enough. But sometimes, the problem isn't a lack of clarity. The other person simply doesn't want to respect the limit. This is where consistency changes everything. Imagine you say, "If this conversation becomes insulting, I'm going to end it." Then the insults begin. Instead of arguing about whether the insult was really an insult, you calmly end the conversation. You don't threaten, you don't deliver a speech, you don't stay for another hour trying to make the other person understand. Your action communicates what your words already said. And this can be uncomfortable because people who are accustomed to having access to your time, attention, emotions, or energy may test the new boundary. They may become angry. They may accuse you of being selfish, uncaring, dramatic, disrespectful, or difficult. They may tell you that you've changed. You probably have changed. But changing doesn't automatically mean you're doing something wrong. A healthy boundary isn't designed to control another person. You cannot say you are never allowed to get angry. That's an attempt to control their emotions. A boundary sounds different. "If you start yelling at me, I will leave the conversation." You're not controlling their behavior. You're deciding what you will do to protect yourself. The most important part is following through. If you repeatedly announce consequences but never act on them, the other person learns that your limits are negotiable. But when your actions consistently match your words, the pattern changes. You don't need to become aggressive. You don't need revenge. You don't need to prove that you're stronger. You simply become predictable in protecting yourself. And sometimes that quiet consistency is far more powerful than any confrontation because it communicates something very clear: access to you is no longer unlimited, and disrespect no longer guarantees your continued participation. One of the biggest changes happens when you stop allowing every provocation to control your emotional state. If you've spent a long time dealing with someone who constantly criticizes, accuses, insults, contradicts, or deliberately pushes your buttons, you may have learned to respond immediately. The moment they say something unfair, you feel the urge to defend yourself. The moment they accuse you of something, you want to prove them wrong. The moment they become angry, you feel responsible for fixing the situation. Eventually, their behavior begins determining your emotional temperature. But what happens when you pause? Instead of immediately responding, you take a breath and ask yourself, does this actually require an answer? That small pause can create an enormous difference. You begin separating genuine communication from deliberate provocation. Not every statement deserves your attention, and not every accusation deserves a defense. Someone might say, "You're selfish." Your old response might have been an explanation. "I'm not selfish, and let me tell you everything I've done for you." Your new response might simply be, "I don't agree with that." And then you stop. You don't provide 20 examples. You don't argue for an hour. You don't desperately try to force them to see you differently. This doesn't mean becoming silent in situations where communication genuinely matters. It doesn't mean tolerating abuse or pretending harmful behavior doesn't exist. It means becoming more selective about where you invest your emotional energy. Provocation often works because it creates urgency. You feel that you must respond immediately, or the accusation will stand. But you don't have to defend yourself against every statement someone makes about you. Their opinion can exist without becoming your emergency. The more you practice this, the more comfortable you become with allowing someone to be disappointed, angry, or mistaken about you without rushing in to repair their feelings. And that can feel strange at first because you're breaking an old pattern. You're no longer asking, "How do I make this person stop being angry?" You're asking, "What response is healthiest for me right now?" That question changes everything because emotional strength isn't the absence of feelings. You can still feel hurt, angry, or anxious. The difference is that you no longer automatically hand those emotions the steering wheel. You pause, choose your response, and refuse to let someone else's provocation decide what you do next. And if you've ever found yourself exhausted from explaining the same thing over and over again, take a moment to recognize this. You don't have to earn the right to have a boundary. If this message is resonating with you, follow or subscribe, because we're going deeper into the psychology behind these patterns. And more importantly, how to protect your peace without becoming consumed by the person who disturbed it. When someone repeatedly withdraws during conflict, it can create an intense urge to chase them. You may find yourself sending another message, making another phone call, apologizing for things you didn't do, or desperately trying to figure out what went wrong. The silence becomes so uncomfortable that restoring contact feels more important than understanding whether the relationship is actually healthy. And this is where a painful cycle can develop. One person pulls away, the other becomes anxious and pursues. The first person gains reassurance that they still have emotional influence, and eventually the cycle repeats. When you stop chasing, you interrupt that pattern. This doesn't mean you should ignore someone who genuinely needs space. Healthy relationships allow people to take time to calm down, reflect, and return to a respectful conversation. The difference is whether the withdrawal is communicated responsibly or repeatedly used to create fear, punishment, or emotional uncertainty. Instead of immediately thinking, "What did I do wrong?" you can begin asking, "What is happening here and what do I actually need?" That question moves your attention away from controlling the other person's reaction and back toward your own well-being. You might send one respectful message, "I'm willing to talk when we're both ready to have a respectful conversation." Then you allow the other person to make their choice. You don't send 10 additional messages trying to force a response. You don't apologize simply to restore contact. You don't abandon your boundaries because the silence makes you uncomfortable. And yes, this can feel incredibly difficult. When you've become accustomed to chasing, not chasing can initially feel like you're doing something wrong. You may fear that if you don't pursue them, they'll leave permanently. But that fear can reveal how much emotional responsibility you've been carrying for the relationship. A healthy connection cannot depend entirely on one person constantly repairing every rupture. If someone needs space, you can respect it. If someone wants to communicate, they can communicate. If someone chooses to remain distant, you don't have to destroy your dignity trying to pull them closer. The goal isn't to make them chase you. The goal is to stop chasing someone at the expense of yourself. Because when you stop pursuing every withdrawal, you create room to observe the relationship more clearly. You begin seeing whether the other person is capable of mutual communication, accountability, and respect without you having to carry the entire emotional burden. One of the most powerful things you can do after a painful relationship is move forward without making your entire healing process about revenge. When someone has hurt you deeply, it is completely understandable to imagine them finally realizing what they lost, regretting how they treated you, or experiencing the same pain they caused you. You may want them to see you become successful, happy, confident, and completely unaffected. But there is a hidden problem with that mindset. If your happiness depends on them witnessing it, then they are still occupying space in your life. You may have physically walked away, but emotionally, you're still performing for them. Real healing begins when you stop asking, "How can I make them regret losing me?" and start asking, "What kind of life do I want now?" That shift sounds simple, but it can be profound. You stop posting things hoping they'll notice. You stop checking whether they're watching your stories. You stop asking mutual friends what they're doing. You stop imagining their reaction to your success. You stop making every achievement a message directed toward the person who hurt you. Instead, your life slowly becomes about you again. You reconnect with people you may have neglected. You rediscover interests that disappeared while you were consumed by conflict. You create routines that make you feel grounded. You begin making decisions based on your values rather than on how someone else might react. And perhaps most importantly, you allow yourself to heal without needing the other person to suffer. That doesn't mean what happened wasn't wrong. It doesn't mean you excuse harmful behavior. It doesn't mean you forget the lessons you learned. Forgiveness, if it ever comes, is not the same thing as reconciliation, and you are not required to forgive someone in order to move forward. It simply means you refuse to make their behavior the organizing principle of your future. Because revenge keeps you emotionally connected. You remain focused on whether they're jealous, whether they're struggling, whether they regret it, or whether they finally realized your worth. Freedom looks different. You don't need them to regret losing you because you no longer need them to validate what you lost. Your success becomes yours. Your peace becomes yours. Your future becomes yours. And eventually, the most satisfying thing isn't knowing whether they noticed you moved on. It's realizing that you stopped looking back to check. One of the hardest parts of healing from a deeply confusing relationship is accepting that you may never receive the acknowledgement you wanted. You may spend months or even years hoping the other person will eventually sit down, understand what happened, take responsibility, and say, "I see what I did to you." That hope is understandable because when someone has caused harm and then denies, minimizes, or rewrites what happened, you naturally want the record corrected. You want the truth recognized. You want confirmation that you weren't imagining everything. But sometimes that acknowledgement never comes, and waiting for it can keep you emotionally attached to the very person you're trying to move beyond. You might repeatedly explain what happened, provide examples, revisit old conversations, or search for the perfect words that will finally make them understand. But if someone is unwilling to take responsibility, Giving them more evidence doesn't necessarily create accountability. It can simply create another opportunity for argument, denial, or blame. The turning point comes when you begin saying to yourself, "I know what I experienced." That statement doesn't require their agreement. You can recognize that something hurt you without getting permission to feel hurt. You can acknowledge that a relationship was unhealthy without convincing the other person that it was unhealthy. You can decide that a behavior crossed your boundaries without waiting for someone else to confirm that your boundary was reasonable. This doesn't mean assuming that every interpretation you have is automatically perfect. Healthy self-reflection still matters. You can examine your own behavior, acknowledge mistakes, and learn from the relationship. But self-reflection is different from endlessly placing your reality on trial before someone who has no intention of understanding it. At some point, you have to decide what matters more, being validated by that person or rebuilding trust in yourself. Because if your healing requires their confession, they still hold the key. If your healing can begin without it, you take that key back. You don't need them to say they were wrong before you can leave. You don't need an apology before you can establish distance. You don't need them to agree with your memories before you can trust your own experience. The deepest freedom comes when you stop waiting for someone else to give you closure and begin creating closure through your own choices, boundaries, and acceptance of what you now understand. And sometimes closure isn't a conversation. Sometimes closure is simply deciding that you don't need another explanation to move forward. There is another level of emotional freedom that comes when you realize you no longer need a narcissistic person to understand your experience, validate your feelings, or agree with your decision. At first, this can seem almost impossible. When someone has repeatedly questioned your reality, minimized your feelings, or turned every conflict into a debate about your character, you naturally want one final conversation where everything becomes clear. You imagine explaining it perfectly and finally hearing, "You're right, I understand now." But healing cannot depend on that moment, because sometimes the person who contributed to your pain is not the person who can provide the clarity you need. You may explain yourself carefully and still be accused of exaggerating. You may describe exactly what hurt you and still be told you're too sensitive. You may explain why you are leaving and still be called selfish. At some point, continuing to seek understanding becomes another form of emotional dependence. The shift happens when you can say, "You don't have to agree with me for me to honor my experience." That doesn't mean you stop reflecting on yourself. It doesn't mean you assume you're perfect or that every conflict was entirely someone else's fault. Healthy healing includes looking honestly at your own behavior and learning from your mistakes. But there is a difference between self-reflection and repeatedly asking another person to determine whether your feelings are legitimate. You don't need someone else to certify that you were hurt. You don't need their permission to establish distance. You don't need their agreement before making a decision about your life. And you certainly don't need to keep returning to the same conversation hoping that a different explanation will produce a different response. This is where emotional autonomy begins. You stop making your peace dependent on another person's ability or willingness to understand you. You can acknowledge that they may tell their own version of the story, they may blame you, they may misunderstand your motives, they may never acknowledge what happened, and you can still move forward. Because closure isn't always something another person gives you. Sometimes closure is the moment you stop asking them to give you what they were never willing or able to provide you. Choose your boundaries. You trust what you've learned. You protect your peace, and you allow your future to become more important than getting the past perfectly explained. The real lesson behind all 7 of these things is that you don't need to become more powerful than a narcissistic person. You need to become less controlled by the dynamic itself. You stop chasing their approval. You stop explaining yourself endlessly. You set boundaries and actually keep them. You stop reacting to every provocation. You stop chasing when they withdraw. You move forward without needing revenge. And eventually, you stop waiting for them to admit what happened or validate what you experienced. That is where your power begins to return. Not because you found the perfect words to defeat them, not because you finally made them understand your worth, and not because you've discovered how to hurt them in return. Your power returns because you stop organizing your life around their reactions. You realize that you don't have to win every argument. You don't have to correct every accusation. You don't have to prove that you're a good person to someone committed to seeing you negatively. You don't have to keep knocking on a door that repeatedly opens only to pull you back into the same cycle. And perhaps the most important realization is this: healing isn't about making someone else feel the consequences of losing access to you. Healing is about becoming someone who no longer needs that person's reaction to feel whole. So if you're waiting for them to finally understand, consider giving yourself permission to stop waiting. If you're waiting for the perfect apology, remember that your healing cannot be placed on hold indefinitely. And if you're wondering how to make them realize your worth, turn the question inward. How can you begin realizing your own worth without requiring their recognition? Because the deepest form of freedom isn't when they finally understand that they lost you. It's when you no longer need them to understand anything at all. You simply know who you are. You know what you will and will not accept. And you choose to build a life where your peace is no longer negotiable.